All right. So I can't tell. My phone's a little bit off of the building's clock. We'll kind of get going a little bit early here, or right on time. I'm not 100% sure which one's accurate, but some things I want to mention before we jump into material. So that Canvas discussion is due at the end of the week, Friday. So please do not forget about that. Get that done early in the week as early in the week as possible. Should have it completed before we go to spring break. Because of spring break, things are going to be a little bit different in that the Module 9 quiz won't be due until that Monday we come back from spring break, right? So it's almost like I'm treating like spring break isn't happening. They're always due on Monday night, so we'll be doing that Monday night after we return from spring break. If you don't want to forget and you want to do it ahead of time, it'll be released after class on Thursday, so you can get it done before spring break if you want to. Now, the CL sessions will be this Thursday, as usual. There's no CL sessions over spring break, but the Module 9 CL sessions will be this Thursday, and then also that Monday we return from spring break. Okay? But once again, it's almost like we're treating that week like it's not happening. Now, there is no Module 10 reading that's due, because what are we doing after we get back from spring break? We've got a review class and then the exam. So there's no new material for that week after spring break. So there's no new module reading. Okay. Also, I'll put up an announcement about this, but the CL sessions that are going to be this Thursday, one of the CL leaders is not available. And so I think it's the Geological Sciences building. There won't be any CL sessions there, but all of the other ones, there's going to be 2 at every single time slot. It's just that third one is not going to be available. Okay. So I'll get an announcement up about that on Canvas just so I can kind of make sure everybody knows that. Okay. Other than that, I think that should take care of all the housekeeping stuff. I did want to mention, I tried to update those CL points. If they don't look completely accurate, they're not reflecting in last night's CL. I just had some time yesterday to kind of update them. I'll get them updated tomorrow, and that should include all of the kind of current attendance from like this past week. So if there's a small discrepancy, hold off. I'm just trying to get them updated as often as possible. I updated them yesterday, so they wouldn't include last night's. Okay. Any other questions before we kind of get started in material here? Okay. All right. So last week, we kind of focused on consumers primarily. This week, we're going to focus on producers or firms. Okay. Now, we'll still use some of the concepts that we talked about in previous modules with consumers, but we're primarily going to be focusing on how firms make decisions and more specifically, what their cost structures look like. Okay. So we first have to get some terminology out of the way and kind of think about what is a firm trying to do. So when a firm is operating, right, they're trying to maximize what? Profits, which are going to take into account revenue. We've talked about total revenue is the price I'm selling something for times quantity, but it also factors in my costs. So we're going to do a deeper dive into the costs. What we do in this module, especially on Thursday, is really going to be what we build on for the last 4 weeks of the class. Right? So it's really important we have a good understanding of what's going on in this module. So here we'll start to talk about, okay, we know they care about their costs because that's part of profits, but we can break this down to 2 types of costs. So the usual costs we think about are going to be things that we like are handing money over for, or what we call explicit costs, right? So these are going to be things like I have to pay my workers' wages, right? So those are my labor costs. I have to buy machinery. I have to pay for rent. These are all things I'm handing money over for, or what we call explicit costs. These show up on the accounting books. Now, what doesn't show up on the accounting books is going to be, well, anytime I do something, what do I always have? All the way back in Module 1, I'm going to have opportunity costs. We're going to give them a slightly different term, but really it means the same thing. For the firm, we kind of call their opportunity costs implicit costs, right? So if I run, producing this product, what product am I not producing? Right? If I'm in this specific market for this good, what market am I not? Right? That's my foregone profits. Right? Or if I'm using money to invest in the firm, I'll kind of show you some examples later on. Maybe I could take that same amount of money and invest it into the stock market. I'm foregoing some returns on my investment there. Okay. So implicit costs are essentially going to be things we don't hand money over for, or my opportunity costs. Okay. So we're making this differentiation between the 2 types of costs a firm faces, right? And I already mentioned it could not just be like foregone wages I could be making somewhere else, but foregone returns to if I took the money I'm investing into my firm, I could have been investing it into the stock market or some other kind of financial product. Okay. So our total costs are just going to be the sum of these two, and we should be making decisions based off not just our explicit, but also our implicit costs, which are both included in our total costs. Okay. So I'll set this up in more of a consumer kind of context. We'll see. I made an error in my math in the last section, so we'll see if I can avoid it here today. So I've got a slide that kind of looks at this, but I tried to look at some numbers that are like specific to you guys. So I was looking up, and if you're in Kelly, and I'm rounding here, but if you're out of state, I think like the average cost of tuition a year is something like $40,000, right? So if I just think about over the next 4 years, that's going to give me what? $160,000 is the cost of my tuition, right, to get this college degree. Now, it also had like the estimated, and I'm not sure how accurate this is. I'm sure they downplay it a little bit. But let's say like room and board or food, the total kind of cost of everything else you need every year while you're in college, they had it posted to be about $15,000 over 4 years. We'll kind of call that $60,000. Okay. So if I'm thinking about what are my total explicit costs, what am I explicit. What am I handing money over for? Tuition, and then whatever it costs me to live, right, in Bloomington and to be able to attend classes. So here this would be $220,000. Right? Now I also went out and looked at what is the salary of someone in Bloomington without a college degree. It told me on average that was $35,000 a year. So we'll get to this in a second. But it also said the average starting salary of a Kelly graduate is $75,000. So if you can think about once I get my college degree, how much additional money am I going to make every year? $40,000 over the next 10 years. And we could kind of do a lifetime, but here we'll just think about over the next 10 years, what's the return to that college degree? Well, if every year I'm making $40,000 additional dollars over 10 years, kind of I'd be making, you can think about my total wages would be $400,000. Okay. So if I'm thinking about my profits or my returns to this college degree, I might be thinking about, okay, I'm making $400,000 additional dollars over the next 10 years once I leave college. It cost me $220,000 to get that degree. My kind of net benefit here would be what? $180,000. So should I go to college? Looks like yes. Those returns are pretty significantly high and positive, right? But if I factor in not just my explicit costs, but what were my implicit costs? If I could make $35,000 a year, instead of going to class, I'm working this kind of full-time job, I'd be making what? $140,000 over those 4 years. So what was my implicit cost? If I'm making the decision, I should also be factoring in those costs as well, in which case the returns to my college degree look quite a bit small. Now, they're still positive. Did I do my math right here? 340, yeah, right? 400 minus 340 is 60,000. So they're still positive, but they're a lot smaller, yeah. Oh, sorry. Thank you. See, you guys got to call me out if I look at these numbers wrong. So I've got what? Here, this would be 40,000, right? Talking and trying to write. So they're still positive. The same kind of thing I was saying lines up with this, but they're not as large as they were before. In fact, what happens if instead of 35,000, let's say maybe I was in a different, in California, right? The amount of money I could be making, maybe there's some jobs. I don't know, maybe if I'm starting like my own social media or YouTube channel, I can make 50,000. Well, what's that going to do to my implicit costs? It's going to, what am I foregoing? Now I'm not making $35,000 a year, but making 50,000. So my implicit costs are going to go up to what? So if I can make 50,000 a year, my total implicit cost over the next 4 years would be 200. Now, when I subtract 200 here, I'm actually losing money by going to college. So when my implicit costs increase, when I don't factor those in, it looks like the returns to a college education are really high. But if the wages I could be making are significantly higher elsewhere, over those 4 years, I'm not making those wages, I'm going to be increasing my implicit costs. Okay. So this is just a kind of quick, dirty example to just think about how these implicit costs matter, even if I'm not a firm, right? Even if I'm making a decision as a consumer. This was the idea. We shouldn't be just factoring in explicit costs, but also these opportunity costs, or what we're now calling for the firm, implicit costs. Okay. So I'll give you a different example where we're thinking about this more as in a firm context, right? And I had some values here. I think these are kind of old, but we can think about our costs aren't just the sticker. This was like in-state tuition. They're not just the sticker price that, IU puts out there. They're not factoring in those implicit costs. The actual cost every year to you to attend college is much higher, right? Because what could you be doing with your time? You could be working a full-time job, right? So let's think about this in the context of a firm. We kind of already talked through these, but they're trying to maximize profits, right? Now, they don't want to just factor in explicit costs. They should also be factoring in implicit costs, okay? So what will kind of make a differentiation between with the firm is accounting versus economic profits. Accounting profits, these are the numbers that firms put out there, where it's my total revenues minus my total explicit costs, right? And so it might look like I'm making $100,000 of profit operating the current market I'm in. But if I did switch my production process over to something that I could sell for more money, maybe I'm foregoing making $400,000 of profit in a different industry. Well, once I factor that in, my accounting profits that look like they were positive, when I factor in those implicit costs, or what we call our economic profits, they might actually be negative. Because if I'm not in this other industry where I could be making even more money or even higher profits in the current industry I'm in, I shouldn't stay in the industry that I'm in. I should switch. Right? So we should be making decisions not just based off our explicit costs. Even though accounting profits might be positive, if I factor in those implicit costs, maybe they're in fact negative. Okay? And we'll kind of walk through how this could be the case or kind of think through in some examples, right? So our goal as a firm should not be to maximize accounting profits. It should be to maximize economic profits, factoring in all types of costs. Okay. So let's say I've got someone who wants to open a restaurant. Okay. Their current estimates, they know that if they open this restaurant in Bloomington, they can make $500,000. They've got all these explicit costs, right? I've got to pay my workers. I've got to buy the food or raw materials. I've got to rent the building space. I've got to pay for, ovens and grills, whatever, like different machinery, right? So if I look at my total revenue minus my total explicit costs, that should give me my accounting profits, right? So it looks like here, should I open up this restaurant? Well, my accounting profits are positive, so we might think, yeah, it definitely should, right? But what do we not factor in? Implicit costs. Instead of owning my own business, my own restaurant, what could I be doing with my time? Working for somebody else. Right? So let's say I'm in like Indianapolis and I could work for like a high-end restaurant as a chef. And I don't know, this might seem outrageous, but let's say I could make $150,000 just to make the point. Well, if I have my own restaurant, I'm making $100,000. But if I work for someone else, I can be making $150,000. So what should I choose to do if I'm trying to maximize how much money I'm making? Go work for someone else. Right? I'd be making even more money than by having my own business. Now, I can make this decision if I look at the economic profits of starting my own restaurant. So we had the accounting profits were $100,000. What did this not factor in? My foregone wages. If I subtract also those implicit costs, that opportunity cost of $150,000, what would my economic profits be? Negative $50,000. So should I start my own restaurant? No. Right? So when I factor in these implicit costs, right, it can switch my decision making. Now, just to kind of get at these concepts, right? Let's say instead of making $150,000 for someone, I'm in Bloomington. Even if I work for a good restaurant, I can only make $50,000. If my implicit costs are lower, what's going to happen to my economic profits? They're going to go up, right? My opportunity costs are lower. Those are factored into my economic profits. My economic profits will be higher. Now, what's happening to my accounting profits? They don't factor in these implicit costs, so they're not going to change at all. But we shouldn't be making our decision based off those accounting profits. We should be factoring in all types of costs, making decisions based off of our economic profits. Okay. So if I can't make as much money as a chef, my implicit costs go down. Instead of being negative, my economic profits might now be positive, right? I factored in kind of a lower foregone wage. Now, I also want to just kind of make this point that it's not just foregone wages when I'm thinking about a firm making their decision. In fact, for most firms, it's not like I'm going to leave that industry and go work for someone else. I'm probably just going to have a business in a different segment. But what's another type of opportunity cost? If I've taken $400,000 and I put it into this business, what could I have been doing with that $400,000? Investing it. If I put it in mutual funds tied to the S&P or some other financial package, I'm going to have returns to that investment. So by using that money to start my own business or to run the firm, what am I not doing with that money? I'm not investing it. The foregone kind of returns to my investment are also another type of opportunity or implicit costs. So here I thought about this person starting a restaurant. If instead they worked for someone else and they only made $50,000, that's part of their implicit cost. But another type of implicit cost is instead of starting my own business, I could take that $400,000 and invest it somewhere else and make some returns on that. Okay? Once again, we can think through this thought experiment. If the returns are currently really high to the stock market, mutual funds tied to the S&P, if the returns are higher, what's going to happen to my implicit cost if I run my own restaurant? Well, I'm not investing the money anymore, so my implicit costs are going to be higher, meaning my economic profits for opening up my own restaurant are going to be low. So I can think about how these implicit costs are going to change my economic profits. Now, if the returns are higher to this investment, what happens to my accounting profits? No change, right? They don't factor in these implicit or opportunity costs, right? So these are kind of some base level examples of thinking about why factoring in implicit costs matter, okay? Any questions on this before we keep moving? Okay, so let's now think about a term that we call sunk costs. So be kind of similar. I mean, we're going to have a different terminology for it. I'll put it first kind of in the context of like individual decision making, and then we'll think about what it looks like for a firm. So the idea of a sunk cost is no matter what I do, no matter what decision I make, I'm going to have to pay this cost no matter what. Okay. So if that's the case, when I'm making that decision, if I have to pay this cost no matter what I do, I shouldn't be factoring into my decision-making process. So we can think through kind of an example as to how this looks, and I think it'll make a little more sense. But kind of it lines up with this idea of there's no use crying over spilt milk. The milk's already spilled, right? I've now got to kind of, doesn't matter what I do moving forward, it's still going to be spilled, right? So let's think about an example, not that everyone's going to movies anymore, but let's say someone decides, right? They go and the ticket cost, let's just make it nice and easy, $10. So if I was choosing to go to this movie, what must have been true about the marginal benefit relative to the marginal cost? If you choose to do something, the marginal benefit would be greater than or technically equal to the marginal cost. Let's assume that marginal benefit is greater than marginal cost. If I go to this movie, what's my marginal cost? The price of that ticket. So it must have been the marginal benefit is greater than $10. Now, let's say on the way to the movie, I got my wallet and somehow I lost a $10 bill in it. I don't know where it went. What would be the marginal cost if I decide to still buy a movie ticket? Well, I've already lost the $10. If I buy a ticket, my total cost is now $20. So what was the change in my cost there? 10. So I have the same marginal cost. If my marginal benefit was above 10 before, is it still going to be above 10? Yes. So as long as I have enough money, I'm going to still choose to go to this movie. The idea that I lost that $10, it doesn't matter if I go to the movie or not. That $10 is gone. That cost of $10, I lost that $10 bill, still going to be there, right? So we make decisions not based off of total costs. We make decisions based off of marginal costs, okay? Same kind of thought experiment. If I bought a ticket, so I've already paid the $10 and then I lose it. Well, if I go and buy another one, what's the change in my total cost? I've already spent 10. If I buy another ticket, I've spent 20. What's my marginal cost? If I don't go to the movie, I lost this ticket, my cost would be $10. I already paid for it. I lost the tickets. If I decide to go to the movie, I've now bought 2 tickets. The total amount of money I've spent is 20. But what's my marginal cost? First ticket is gone. I already paid for it. So the change in my total cost, I'm going from 10 to 20. My marginal cost is still $10. If my marginal benefit was greater than the marginal cost of 10 before, it's still greater than my marginal cost. So this is the idea. If I have something, a cost, and no matter what I do, if I go to the movie or I don't, I'm going to still have that same mark or that same kind of loss of $10. It shouldn't be factored into my decision-making process.
What's the difference in change in income, which would factor?
What do you mean change in income?
Like if you have a decrease in income, then your marginal cost.
If I have $500, what's the cost of a movie ticket? $10. If I have $1,000, what's the cost of a movie ticket? $10. My income doesn't factor into what my marginal cost is on. If we want to go break down things into like income substitution effects, that's a whole different topic, right? Here we're just thinking about if I'm making decisions based off of the marginal benefit and the marginal cost, my income doesn't factor into what my marginal costs are, right? It's just that explicit kind of cost of whatever I'm choosing to do. This might make a little more sense when we put this in the context of a firm, okay? Just kind of leading out with an example you can kind of maybe think about like as an individual. Because all of us are consumers, we're not often firms, right? So, kind of this is the idea. If I'm a company and I take a huge loss, so let's say this year I lose $100,000, and I'm making the decision, do I stay open? Well, if I stay open and I think I can make $300,000 in this next year, should I factor in that I already lost $100,000? No, that's gone no matter if I stay in this industry or I don't. So my decision making should never factor in these sunk costs that don't depend on what I do moving forward. So when I lose the ticket, I still should make the same decision based off of the marginal benefit and the marginal cost of choosing to buy that second. If I have a huge loss in year 1, should I stay open? Well, as long as I think the returns in year 2 are going to be really high, yes. It doesn't matter how much I lost in the first period. As long as I have enough money to kind of continue to operate. But once those losses occur, they aren't factored into my future decision making. Okay. Any questions on this idea? We'll relate this once we kind of get further into class talking about a firm's cost structure. We'll start to call these sunk costs fixed costs. Okay. And we'll see that they don't change our decision making. Okay. So what do we say to the sunk cost fallacy? A lot of people don't make this correct decision. We say not today, right? We shouldn't be factoring in these sunk costs into our kind of future decisions. Okay. So we're going to pivot a little bit because before we get to costs, we have to understand how factors of productions will influence those costs. So we're going to talk about kind of a difference between the long and the short run. So in the long run, and here's where it's not going to ever be a certain number of years or a certain number of months. This would look different in different industries. But in the long run, the pure definition is if I could change every factor of production, I'm in the long run. That could be 10 years, 20 years, over the next 50. So what are these factors of productions that I can change in the long run, but I can't change them in the short run? Well, typically we think about in the short run, I can't like overnight relocate my business to another country, right? That's something I might be able to do over the next course of a year or even 5 years, right? But I can't do it overnight. So day to day, we're typically thinking about we're in the short run. There's going to be some factors I can't change overnight. I can't even change them in the next week, right? So anytime I have a factor of production that's fixed, I can't change it in the current time period I'm looking at, the next day, the next week. Those things we can't change, we're going to call fixed. Okay? Now, what can I often always change in the short run? Not just over the next 24 hours, but technically minute to minute. I can always fire a worker, right? So labor, we typically think about, yes, I can change it in the long run. I can hire and fire workers over the next year, but I can also hire and fire workers minute to minute in the short run as well. So some factors in the short run will be fixed. I can't move my production facility's location, not even to a different country, but a different state overnight. You can't even do that within the next month or two often, right? I can't implement some new machinery in the next week sometimes, but I can implement it over the next 6 months, right? So in the long run, everything is variable. If I have enough time, I can move to a different country, I can change land, I can buy new machinery, but in the short run, some of those things will be fixed. So we're going to focus on the one thing that is often not fixed, which is labor. Okay. So even if I'm in the short run, I often can change how many workers I'm hiring. Okay. So here I'm thinking about how many workers do I want to hire. So when a firm is thinking about how many workers it's going to hire, what it's really doing is trying to target a certain level of output. As I hire more workers, what happens to the level of output or the number of units I can produce? If I hire more workers, I can produce more. So my output is going to be a function of how much labor I hire, but also this goes all the way back to module 2, when we're looking at our kind of per worker production function. As I invest more in capital, so even in the short run, I'm thinking about over the next month, I can implement some new machinery. If I invest more in capital, what can I also do? Increase my output. Now, if you go all the way back to module 2, remember, what did we say? Give them computers. And then what do I invest in next? Maybe I give them better software. What do I invest the next $100 in? Nicer chairs so they're comfy and can work more effectively. I start to invest in the things that are less and less effective at increasing output or making my workers more efficient. The same kind of idea is going to exist for labor. Who do I want to hire first? Whatever worker is why do you want to make your resumes look really good? You're trying to convince firms that you are the best worker, or you're the most effective worker, or that you're going to increase output by the most. So as I hire more workers, I know that output is going to increase, but the rate at which it increases is going to be highest when I hire that first best worker. Who am I going to hire next? Second best. They're going to increase output by a slightly smaller amount. And then the third best, and the fourth, et cetera, et cetera. So when I'm thinking about this production function, we're going to specifically focus on not capital, but workers, labor, the number of workers I hire. Okay. So I'll think about kind of this simple, weird, maybe it seems weird, but it is a firm. If I think about Chipotle, right? So let's think about initially, I'm thinking about, all these applicants. Who do I want to hire first? Well, if I don't hire anybody, what's my output going to be? 0. If I hire that first worker, maybe now they can produce on their own 1,000 burritos in a day or a week. I don't know, whatever it is. So how much did my output increase by? 1,000. Who am I going to hire next? The second best worker. Maybe now my total number of burritos I can produce is 1,800. So even though output went up, what's the change in output? It only went up by 800. If I hire the third best worker, maybe my output goes up, but how much did it go up by? 600. So what's happening to the change in my output? It's increasing, but at a decreasing rate. The slope of this output function is telling me the change in output, or what we'll end up calling not just the marginal output, but the marginal product of labor. How many additional units each additional worker is adding to my firm's production process. Okay. So here we can kind of think about, I was using this terminology of marginal output for my workers. You can think of it that way, that's fine. Just like what we typically, the terminology we use when we're talking about workers, it's the marginal product of workers, or the marginal product of labor. If I want the marginal anything, so if I wanted the marginal cost, that was going to be my change in total cost divided by a change in quantity. Here, if I want the marginal product of labor, that's going to be the change in my output or my product divided by the change in the number of workers I was hiring or the change in the quantity of labor. So this is how we would calculate our marginal product of labor. I'm going to draw something out for you that I think will kind of help with this idea or help solidify this idea. So I'm going to write this out fairly quickly because we already had this in table form. So we had, if I hired the first worker, I was getting 1,000 burritos. second worker, whoops, I overshot it, 1,800. Third worker, 2,400. Fourth worker, I think I had 2,800, right? So my output function, we said it's always increasing as I hire more workers, but what's happening to its slope? It's decreasing, right? So if I wanted to map this out onto the marginal product of labor, so I'm thinking about for each of these workers I hire, so when I write QL here, it's the quantity of labor or the number of workers I'm hiring, okay? So if I want to think about how do I calculate the marginal product of labor? So for each of these workers, what was their change that they were causing in output? So our marginal product of labor is the change in output over a change in the number of workers, or said differently, a change in output we typically think about, that's the quantity of the good I'm producing, divided by a change in the number of workers or the quantity of labor I'm hiring. So this is really just shorthand for kind of what we're thinking, all right? The change in output, well, my output is the quantity of the good I'm producing, change the number of workers, that's a change in the quantity of labor that I'm hiring, okay? So for this first worker, what was the marginal product of labor? Well, output was going up by 1,000. Here, it's a nice, easy example because the changes in quantity of labor here are always what? 1, so I'm dividing by 1, it's a little bit easier. So here, my marginal product of labor, didn't leave myself a lot of room, was 1,000. But what about for that second worker? How much were they changing the output by? Only, I'm going from 1,000 to 1,800, only 800. And then what about the third worker? They were only changing output by 600. I could kind of keep going through this thought process. I didn't leave myself a lot of room here, but I could do it for the fourth, the fifth, the sixth, etc. So what's happening to the marginal product of labor? It is decreasing. As I hire more workers, how much additional output are they adding? A smaller and smaller amount. Because who did I hire first? The most effective or productive worker. I then hire the next most effective and productive worker. So as I hire more workers, my marginal product of labor, or how much they're increasing my output by, is going down. Okay. Any questions on this idea before we keep moving? We're okay with this? You sure? Okay. So this is kind of connecting our output function to the marginal product of labor here. Now we could think about this in a slightly different way without kind of this visual. I could think about this from a table, right? So is this like all of a sudden not very bright, or is it me? Okay, let's try something here. Let's try switching back. Okay. I don't want to play around with this too much. I don't have any idea. Was it like this the whole time? No. Okay, I didn't think so either. If you have any trouble reading anything on here, let me know. I'm not sure why it's all of a sudden kind of grayish, blurred out. But all we're doing is going back to those original quantity of labor numbers, or the original number of workers we were hiring, and the quantity of the product we're creating, which is burritos, right? So if I did this on the kind of graph, I can do the same thing on the table. What's the change in the quantity divided by the change in the number of workers, or the change in labor? 1,000 over 1 is 1,000. We kind of then kept going through, and we saw that that marginal product of labor is always decreasing. Now, if instead I had an example, and let's say I was thinking about the number of workers I'm hiring, instead of jumps of 1, let's say I have like a production process. Maybe I'm thinking about adding like different shifts. So the number of workers I'm hiring is in batches of like 10 instead of 1. How would these marginal product of labor numbers change? So I would still look at the change in output, but I'd now be dividing it by a change in the quantity of labor, which wouldn't be 1. It would now be, so I can hire workers in batches of 10s. So now it would be over a change in the number of workers of 10. All of these would be like what? 100, 80, et cetera, right? I'd just be dividing by a different jump in the quantity of labor. So what's another example we can kind of think about here? If I change the number of workers to 10, I still go through that same thought process. The change in output is 1,000, but now to get that additional 1,000 units, I had to hire 10 workers. All right, so 1,000 over 10 would give me a marginal product of 100. But then it's really the same process. I just keep going through. If I want to go from 10 to 20 workers, change in output is 800. Change the number of workers is now 10, 80, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I still have this decreasing marginal product of labor curve. I'm hiring less and less effective workers, or I'm hiring workers who add smaller and smaller amounts of additional output. Okay. Any questions on this idea before we keep moving? Right. So this should hopefully be somewhat easy, but if I'm thinking about here, I go back to my jumps in the quantity of labor of 1. If I wanted the marginal product of labor for the 5th worker here, what would it be? So it's marginal product. Another way of thinking about this is it's the marginal output. Anytime we want marginal, it's the change in that thing that is responding to a change in whatever we're looking at. So, right, this is like marginal cost, change in total cost divided by a change in quantity or increase. So I want the marginal product of labor for that 5th worker. How much going from that 4th to 5th worker is my marginal, is my output changing by, or what is my marginal product? What, 11 units? Divided by how did I get those additional 11 units? I hired one more worker. 11 over 1 should be simply 11. Okay? Now, let's say instead, to get these same output values, I had to increase the number of workers by 5. What would I do there? I take my change in output of 11, and instead of dividing by 1, I divide it by 5. Right? Nothing too crazy there. I'm just making the point that even though we look at some easier examples, we don't always have to have jumps in the number of workers we're hiring of 1, because depending on our production process, like I said, if I'm adding a whole nother shift, it might be that I have to hire batches of workers, not just in like 1s and 10s, it might have to be like hundreds, right? Depending on how large my production process is. Okay. So we've got this kind of marginal product of labor curve. I said it's decreasing, which essentially represents that the slope of this production function is getting smaller and smaller. And I already mapped that out, thinking about that slope of our output function is really representing the marginal product of labor. So yes, output is increasing as we hire more workers, but it's increasing at a decreasing rate. Okay. So we're now going to kind of break this down. So I don't want to say I was lying to you, but I was giving you kind of an easier version of this marginal product of labor curve than probably what exists in reality. Okay? So we think about typically that as we hire more workers, they become less and less effective. That's the idea of what we call diminishing returns to labor. As I hire more workers, that change in output is becoming smaller and smaller. Right? So what we can see occur is what we call gains from specialization, where even though I'm hiring less and less effective workers, they now can specialize on a task. So I'll give you an example. Let's go back to Chipotle. All right. If I hire one worker, they have to ask you what you want. Burrito bowl. Okay. What kind of rice? You want beans? You want these toppings? What meat do you want? They go down, they have to like bring you up. Okay. Now go all the way back down. Ask the next person what they want. Typically, when you go there, what is there somebody like at every single station? All right. So even though I hire the best worker first, when I hire the next best worker, what can I now do? One person kind of builds the burrito, they hand it off. The next person is like running the credit card, taking the order, right? Now that person, the original first person, doesn't have to do all the tasks. They're just doing one task. And now when I hire the third best worker, well, now one person can just focus on getting the tortilla, rice, and beans. The next person do the meats and toppings. The next person runs the register. Now when I hire four, right? So I'm losing less time having to do every single task on my own as I hire more workers. So when this occurs, even though I'm hiring like the best worker first, then the next best, then the next, they can now specialize on individual tasks. Think about like a larger like firm. If I just hired one worker or even like 10 workers and they have to do everything, they have to do the marketing, so they're doing marketing, they're doing sales, They're looking at having to do the accounting books. They're having to make hiring firing decisions. They're going to be kind of spread thin. But as I hire more and more workers, I can now have some workers only focus on marketing, only focus on accounting, only focus. I can get gains from specialization. My workers aren't spread thin now. They don't have to have a variety of different talents. So they now can just focus on being really productive at one area. So if we ever are hiring more workers and the marginal product is not decreasing, but it's increasing, the only way that can occur, if we're hiring, the best person first and then the second best, is that we must have gains from specialization. Our workers must be able to specialize on tasks, which cancels out the fact that I'm hiring less and less effective workers. Now, eventually, right, even though I might have gains from specialization, once I've exhausted those gains, I'm still hiring less and less effective workers. So even though, like my Chipotle example, even though I'm having now like 5 workers and they can each do a specific task, maybe that 5th worker is really bad, right? So it doesn't matter that they can specialize. They're just a much less effective worker that would kind of cancel out any gains from specialization. And the fact that they're just a bad worker, I now have diminishing returns. So in general, what our marginal productive labor curve will look like is more like something that looks like this. That yes, initially as I'm increasing labor or hiring more workers, maybe that marginal product of labor is going up if I can have them specialize. As I'm hiring less and less effective workers, eventually any gains from specialization that existed are canceled out, right? Or overcome from the fact that I'm hiring really bad workers, right? I'm down to my 50th best worker now, right? Any gains from specialization are gone. I'm just hiring really, really ineffective workers. So initially, we might see this marginal productive labor curve increase, but eventually diminishing returns will take over, okay? Any questions on this idea? I think this is fairly intuitive. And we'll kind of use this again once we connect this to costs, okay? Any questions on this before we keep moving here? Okay. All right. So just one thing that's kind of interesting to mention, might be worth thinking about. In my Chipotle example, if diminishing returns take over and my marginal productive labor is decreasing, eventually what value could it become? Negative or 0? What would that look like? I've now got 10 people working and they're just getting in each other's way, right? Now, we often won't see a firm ever get to that point because if the marginal productive labor is negative, do I ever want to hire that person, right? I always want some positive amount. And in reality, we won't kind of dive into this in this module, but eventually we'll think about, well, it's how much additional output am I getting compared to how much does it cost me to hire that worker, right? So we're really only going to be looking at marginal product of labors that are positive. That doesn't make sense to look at the negative values, okay? So we'll then take this one step further to introduce a concept that will really focus in on Thursday's class. Now, in Thursday's class, we'll relate this to costs, but for now, we'll kind of just be thinking about this marginal and average product of labor. So the average product of labor, how do I find an average? I take the total and I divide it by the number of values I had, right? Oh boy. Oh, yeah, tornadoes happen. So the average product of labor will be my total output divided by the total number of workers that I've hired. That's not the same as our marginal product, because the marginal product was the change in output divided by a change in the number of workers we hired. Okay. So we're going to think about, there is a relationship that exists between our marginal product and our average product. Anytime the amount that we're adding or the marginal output or the marginal product of labor is higher than our old average, well, if I add a value, let's say your current grade is a 70. If you get a 90 on the next exam, what's going to happen to your new average grade? It's going to be higher. If that marginal product is above the old average, my new average product must be even higher, or it's increasing. Your current grade in the class is a 90. That's your average grade. And the next exam, you get a 70. Your new average score is going to be low. If the marginal product of labor is below the old average, my new average has to be lower, or my average product of labor is decreasing, right? Now, if they're the same, there would be no change. Your average score in the class is currently an 80. You get an 80 on the next exam, still have an 80 in the class. All right. So maybe a different way of thinking about why this exists, and then I'll kind of show you a visual. Let's say I'm, I don't know, thinking about a scenario where I want to make the math easy on myself. So let's say, I don't know, I've got two workers, right? Here's kind of the marginal product of labor of both. So how much output total am I getting? 30 units, okay? So this is like my total output, or we can think about this is Q. What is my average product of labor? Well, I've hired two workers. I'm getting a total output of 30. 30 over 2 would be 15, okay? If I add in a value that is above my old average, so let's say I've got these first two workers, I'm now adding in a third, all right? And they're even more productive than my first two. Well, first of all, what must I have here? If my workers are becoming more productive, I have gains from specialization. So my total output is now 60. What's my average product of labor? Well, this marginal product of the third worker is above the old average, so my new average should be higher. Sure enough, what is 60 over 3? 20, right? Anytime that marginal product of labor is above the old average, my new average is higher. That's just a law of mathematics, all right? Now, if instead I think about a scenario, I want to make this easy on myself as well. Well, right? Let's say I add a third worker, but the marginal product of labor is below the old average, right? When I originally had two workers. So now I've got a total output of 40. What's my average product, right? Should be what? 13.33 repeated if I'm doing math in my head correct here, right? So when my marginal product is below the old average, it's going to be pulling my average down, or my new average of product is now even lower, right? This is just a kind of law of mathematics, okay? So what this is going to look like visually, and I think I've got this in the slides, but since we're here, if I think about the number of workers I'm hiring, and I want to plot both the average and the marginal product of labor here on the same curve, okay? So anytime, so let's say I've got, or sorry, I'm jumping the gun here. That's the next topic we're going to look at, not costs. We're still looking at the product of labor. So I've got my marginal product and my average product of labor. Here's kind of that marginal product of labor curve, right? So initially, what did we have here? I had my marginal product as I hire more workers is increasing. I must have my workers are becoming more effective. The only way that's true is if I have gains from specialization. Once my workers start to become less and less effective, what is taken over? Diminishing returns. Okay. Now, if I'm thinking about this relationship of the average product of labor to the marginal product, right? So let's say I've got something that looks like, what do I want here? If my average product of labor curve is something like this, and I try to draw it best I can, but I'm a little off here, I'll show you why. Anytime the marginal product of labor was above my average, what should be true about my new average? My new average should be even higher. Or anytime the marginal product of labor is above the average product, my new average product was increasing, okay? Once I'm looking over here, anytime the marginal product of labor is below my average product of labor, what starts to happen to my average product of labor? It starts to now decrease, right? The amount I'm adding is below the old average. It's pulling my new average to be even lower. So this would be kind of like my marginal product and my average product of labor curve. This is how we know if the marginal product is above the average, it must be pulling the average up, or that my average product of labor is increasing. if the marginal product is ever below the old average, my new average product must be going down or decreasing. So we're going to have a very similar concept next class when we talk about marginal and average costs. Okay. Any questions here before I keep moving? I need something to drink. The nose is going to give out. We're okay with this idea? Okay. So, with this idea in mind, we could also look at this in a table, right? So, we go back, I've got my total output, I've got my total number of workers. How would I find my marginal product of labor? It's just a change in output divided by a change in the number of workers. Here, the change in the number of workers is nice and easy, it's 1. So, first worker is going to increase output by 800. Second worker increases it by 1,000. Third worker increases it by 600, etc. So what must be happening when I go from that first to the second worker? I have what? My marginal product of labor is increasing. I must have gains from specialization. After that point, as I hire the third, fourth, and fifth worker, marginal product of labor is decreasing. What's taken over? Diminishing returns. Now notice, I can prove what I just drew out to you with values. How do I find an average product? I take the total output and I divide it by the total number of workers. So at that first worker, 800 over 1 would give me 800. Now my second worker is adding 1,000 units to production. It's above my old average. My new average should be higher. Sure enough, at that second worker, with a total output of 1,800, divided by the number of workers of 2, my new average is 900, or it's increasing. Now, as soon as my marginal product of labor, I get to hire the third, if it's below my old average, what should be true about my new average? It should be even lower. I should be pulling it down. Sure enough, that third worker, my total output is 2,400, divided by the total number of workers I have, gives me a lower average product of labor. Okay? This will be the case no matter what numbers you plug in here. Okay? Any questions on this idea? Okay. So I already drew this out for us, but this is kind of a nice visual of what it looks like with that average and marginal product of labor relationship. The next thing that we're going to want to talk about is what does this look like? How do we relate the marginal product of labor to a firm's costs, right? So we go all the way back to our original question, which was how is a firm going to maximize profits? They care about revenues and they really want to know what's happening to their costs. Even in the short run, the factor of production I can change is labor. How is that going to influence my costs? Okay. So let's say I've got kind of this Chipotle example. I know these numbers don't make sense, but let's say I'm renting, the monthly rent is $1,000 for this space. Okay. If I produce nothing or I produce 1,000 units, what's happening to my rental cost? Stays the same. So what is it? A sunk cost, or what we'll call for firms, a sunk cost is a fixed cost, just kind of different terminology, right? So for a firm, the fixed cost, the thing that doesn't change as I increase output or hire more workers, that is going to be a fixed cost or a sunk cost, right? So my decision is how much should I produce? I should be ignoring those fixed costs. I'll kind of mention why here in a second. Now, if each worker I hire, let's say I pay them minimum wage, and over the course of, I don't know, a month or whatever, I pay them $2,000. Okay. So if I were to then look at those same quantities for output and the same number of workers, what would my cost of the building always be? The rent I was paying was $1,000. Okay. So if this is all I had to pay, if I think about my marginal costs, how much would my marginal cost be changing by if the only costs I had were the cost of the building? 0. That sunk cost will never change my marginal cost. How do we make decisions? If the marginal benefit is greater than the marginal cost, so technically greater than or equal to. Okay? So these sunk costs or these fixed costs don't end up factoring into our decision making because they won't change our marginal costs. Okay? Now, what will change our costs? Well, as I hire more workers, if I have to pay each worker $2,000, then I have the first worker, I'm paying $2,000. Two workers, I have to pay a total of $4,000, three, $6,000, et cetera, et cetera. So as I want to increase my output here, what's happening to my total costs? I would take the rent or the cost of the building and I would add the cost of labor. So as I want to produce more, as I want to increase output, I have to hire more workers, which is going to cause my total cost to increase. So if I want to produce more units, it's intuitive that I hire more workers, that's going to increase my total costs. But we said, how do we make decisions? It's based off of the marginal cost. Okay? So if I'm thinking about these values, my total cost is always increasing, right? But if I'm concerned with my marginal cost, it would be the change in my total cost divided by a change in quantity, right? Now here, it's not the change in the quantity of workers. My marginal cost should be the change in my total cost divided by a change in how many units I'm producing. So now if I think about here, if I go from 0 to 1,000 burritos, what's the change in my total cost? 2,000. What's the change in my quantity? 1,000. So I think about my marginal cost, it would be what? 2,000 over 1,000, which is 2. If I then want to think about what's the marginal cost of going from 1,000 to 1,800, well, I need to hire a second worker. The change in my total cost is still 2,000, but now the number of additional units I'm getting is only 800. So 2,000 over 800 is now going to be what? 2.5. Because my workers are less and less effective, as I hire each worker, I'm getting less output, but I have to pay those workers that same total wage. All right. And here it's easiest to think about kind of these minimum wage jobs. All right. So the fact that we have this decreasing or this diminishing returns portion, that's going to make my marginal costs actually increase. Right. So I could think about how do I calculate marginal cost? It's the change in my total cost. If that's always the same, but as I hire each worker, the change in my output or my marginal product of labor is always going to be smaller, my costs will be increasing. Right? So another way of thinking about this, so I'll kind of give you a nice visual. So we said here, oops, I've got my quantity of labor and I've got my marginal product of labor. We said it looks something like this, right? Initially, we had gains from specialization, but eventually diminishing returns took over. So if I want to map that out and think about, okay, I'm getting additional output from every worker I hire. So if I'm thinking about for all these different levels of output or the quantity I'm producing, I want to know what's happening to my marginal costs. Okay. Well, if my marginal cost is the change in total cost divided by a change in the number of units I'm producing. Okay. I could think about this slightly differently. So if I have to pay each worker that same like fixed wage, every worker Chipotle hires, they're paying them whatever that minimum wage is times the number of hours they're working. My marginal cost from every worker, or sorry, for every worker I'm hiring, I can think about. Well, that change in total cost will always be the same. But what is the change in the output I'm getting for every worker I hire? The marginal product of labor, right? That change in output from hiring each additional worker was our marginal product of labor. So initially, when I had gains from specialization, what was happening to my marginal product of labor? It was increasing, right? Each worker I hired was producing even more units than the previous one. So what was happening to my marginal costs? Well, if this fraction, the denominator is larger, my marginal cost must be going down, right? So when I have gains from specialization, my marginal costs are actually decreasing, right? Now, once I get to this diminishing returns portion, as I hire more workers, what's happening to their marginal product of labor? It's going down. which means what's happening to my fraction? If the denominator is smaller, this fraction is going up, which represents that my marginal costs are increasing. So anytime I have gains from specialization, my marginal costs are decreasing. Anytime I have diminishing returns taking over, there I know my marginal costs of labor are actually increasing. The intuition is if I'm getting more units out of each worker I hire, and the cost of each worker is the same, the amount, the kind of per dollar amount of every unit must be going down. If my workers are becoming less effective as I hire more of them, pay the same amount of money, well, if I'm getting fewer units of output, the kind of cost per unit is now going up.
Costs.
What cost?
Like you said, the cost to hire one more worker stay the same. If we ever factor in the cost of hiring an extra worker is more than the cost of hiring the person.
So I won't do anything like that for you guys. You could do that. I mean, it would be a more complicated model, but the same principles apply, right? In the sense that if my workers are becoming more effective, right? There, if I have to pay the second worker a smaller amount of money, it only amplifies this effect, right? Now, would I ever pay the second worker a higher salary than the first? I mean, would make a lot of sense, right? I hired the best worker first, they're going to have the highest salary. So yes, if I didn't have this example where wages for each worker were the same, you'd have the same principles, but these effects would be only amplified. So good question, but I won't do anything like that in the Quizzer exam. Any other questions here before we keep moving? Okay. So this is kind of our relationship between the marginal product of labor and our marginal costs. All right. So I could kind of work through an actual table example where I think as I want to increase my output, what is the change in my total cost divided by a change in output? That's just giving my marginal cost. If I go through and do this for every kind of increase in quantity and looking at this table, I'll see that my marginal costs here were always increasing. So what did this firm never have? Never had any gains from specialization. I think this was the original kind of values I gave you back when we only had diminishing returns. Okay. So I think we'll kind of pick up on this next class, right? We'll be thinking more about how does a firm actually maximize out. So I left this open, this slide, sorry, blank. This is kind of what we just worked through on the dot cam. So we'll start next class, slide 32, and we'll kind of break these costs down into fixed cost, variable, we'll break our total cost down into fixed cost, variable cost. We'll think about their relationship with marginal cost and how firms make decisions, okay? So what we'll do now is think about this first quiz. So before you open it, let me change this real quick. So here we'll go 1050. So I think the number that gets you in is 623.5. If I can get this to save, there we go. So 623.5 should get you into that quiz. And we want to verify that. Am I doing this from memory correct? Yep. So 623.5. Feeling nice today. So we'll kind of walk through some of these together. Okay. So this is going back to kind of review some earlier concepts, and then we'll talk through one that's more similar to what we've talked about today. Okay. So we're making this differentiation between accounting and economic profits. Economic profits incorporate what? The accounting profits don't. Implicit cost. So if I own a building space and the rent of that space goes up by $500, well, I own it. What am I paying to run my business out of? Nothing, right? So when rent, I could be renting it out or goes up by 500, what's happening to my explicit cost? Not changing at all. So my accounting profits would not change or stay the same. Now, if I could rent it for $500 more a month, but I'm running my business out of it, what does that increase of $500 cause an increase in? My implicit costs. I'm not renting it to someone, so I'm missing out an additional $500. So my economic profits, if the implicit cost is higher, my economic profits should be going down or decreasing. So my accounting profits wouldn't change if I owned the space, but my economic profits, because it changes the implicit cost, would actually be going down. The implicit costs are higher. I could be renting it out for even more money, but I'm not. So my implicit cost is higher, which means my economic profits are subtracting a larger value and going down. Okay. Yeah. So I told you you own the space.
I'm saying you can rent that.
So if you own the space and you're running your business out, I could be a little more specific there. You own the space, you're running a business. Because inherently to have these costs, you have to be running the business, right? So if I own the space, I'm running the business out of it. If the rent that I could be charging or the rent for that building goes up by 500, well, I own it. I'm not paying that. So it's not an explicit cost. It's something I'm foregoing by running it out to someone else. It's only an implicit cost. But yes, would be a little more specific than that. Like if you own the space and you're running your business out of it, thought it was implied, but yes, I'd be a little more specific. Any other questions on this before we keep moving? So what if instead I had this example where I don't own the space? So I'm running my business out of this space, but I don't own it, I'm renting it. Well, if rent goes up by 500, what's going to happen? My explicit costs. They're going to, I don't own the space and I'm renting it. Rent goes up by 500. My explicit costs will go up by 500, which means my accounting profits will go down and my costs are higher. So my accounting profits here, if I didn't own the space and I run my business out of it, but I'm renting the space, my accounting profits will go down. Now, if I don't own the space, that change in rent of 500 is an explicit cost. Explicit cost is factored into both accounting and economic profits. So if my economic profits change because the explicit cost changed, inherently my economic profits will as well. So changes in explicit costs would cause changes in both types of profits, right? So in this case, both economic and accounting profits would go down. The only thing that changes in economic profits, but not accounting profits, will be changes in implicit costs. Okay. So here, if I have to rent the space, rent is my explicit cost, it would decrease both types of profits. Okay. Any questions on that one before we keep moving? So let's instead think about having a table here. Now I've got different quantities and the different number of workers I'm hiring. If each worker costs me $500, what's the marginal product when I go from that when I go from the 100th to the 200th unit of those workers, and what's happening to my marginal costs? Well, if I want to go from 100 to 200 units, how many additional workers do I have to hire? 2. So what's the change? How do I calculate the marginal product of labor? It's the change in output divided by a change in the number of workers. So if I go from 100 to 200, the change in output is 100. Change in the number of workers is 2. My marginal product of labor is 50. Okay. Now, how do I determine what's happening to the marginal cost? I didn't give you any wages, right? Well, if I go from 0 to 100 units, what would be the marginal product of labor for the first 4 workers? Well, the change in output is 100. The change in the number of workers is 4. My marginal product of labor would be 25. So if it's going from 25 to then 50, my marginal product of labor is increasing, which means I must have what? Gains from specialization. This is where it's maybe an easy way to come out. If I've got gains, what's going to happen to my marginal costs? Well, gains are a good thing, so my marginal costs are going to be going down. right? If I have diminishing returns, that's a bad thing. My marginal cost would be going up. It might be a kind of easy way intuitively to kind of remember those. Okay. So we kind of had to use additional information here. We had to go back one step to see what was happening to our marginal product of labor. Then if we knew it was increasing, we have gains from specialization. We know our marginal costs were decreasing. Okay. Any questions on that one before we kind of go through this last question? Okay. So if I'm now thinking about that marginal cost of the 400th unit. So this one we didn't quite get to, but we can think through based off what we talked about how we calculate this. So if I want to get to that 400th unit, I'm going from a quantity of 300 to 400. How do I calculate a marginal cost? It's the change in my total cost divided by a change in the number of units I'm producing, or the quantity. So here, what's the change in my quantity, or the denominator? I've got to go from 300 to 400, so 100. What's the change in my total cost? Well, if each worker costs me 500, what would be my total cost at 300? 9 times 500. What would be the total cost when I go from 300 to 400 units? Well, I'm now hiring 14 workers, so 14 times 500. Or I can think about what is the change in my cost. Well, if I have to hire 5 additional workers to go from 300 to 400 units, if each worker cost me 500, what was the change in my total cost then? 5 times 500. Or I can calculate those total costs, and hopefully what I see is the change in my total cost would be the exact same value, right? So that I need 5 more workers. Each one cost me 500. The change in my total cost is 2,500. Divided by that change in output of 100 would give me what? 25. So that's kind of, connecting. We can look at these number of workers, thinking about the marginal product of labor, connecting that to our marginal cost. So what we're going to do next class is kind of walk through some similar relationships of average costs and our marginal costs. We're then going to break down these costs into both fixed and variable costs. But before you get too loud, this is where it's still a few minutes and get out here quicker. I don't have to go through this preamble and tell you to be quiet, right? So I've got this set to be due at 10:50. So make sure you're hitting submit before you leave. Let's not treat it as late. So something else I'm going to do before next class. I mentioned that I want to revisit some material from last week. It will not be material that is expected for you to know on the exam, but it might help solidify some of the stuff. It's just a different look at what we talked about in Module 7. So you'll see on YouTube, I'm going to post up an additional video. It's going to basically talking about, some of you might have been thinking, well, why am I spending all of my income on 2 goods? Right? Can't I save some of it? We can actually model savings as a choice between 2 goods, consumption goods and savings goods. So in doing that and going through this little example, it'll probably be like a 5-10 minute long video. It might just kind of give you another real world example of how combining a budget constraint and difference curve. So even though I won't expect you to answer questions on like this choice between consumption and savings goods, it would be kind of an additional good review video of just any budget constraint and difference curve model. Okay, so you'll see that post up before we meet in class on Thursday. Other than that, finish up Module 9 Thursday, and I will see you guys then.